Hello everyone, Posey here. Hope you're all doing well. This video is surely different from what you've come to expect, but I'm planning on transitioning to more analytical video essay type content and moving my more casual uploads like my rapid reviews over to my second channel Tuesdaydon, which by the way you should go subscribe to if you so please. In any case, this will be the first in a series of these video essays, and I hope you're able to come away with a new and interesting perspective after you're done, as I have what I believe to be an interesting perspective to share today. So earlier today I was browsing YouTube when I noticed a recent video by the channel Moon titled Why Pixar is Collapsing, The Coming Pixar Crisis. Now, this sparked my interest for a couple reasons. For one thing, I'm quite an animation enthusiast, I've dabbled in animation myself, and I'm overall interested in the craft, so I was curious what this individual had to say about the apparent downfall of Pixar, the animation studio known and usually beloved by everyone and their grandmother. I was even more curious, however, when I took note of certain aspects of the thumbnail. The most prominent feature of the thumbnail is a character from Onward. To be more specific, she's a gay police officer who shows up in a single scene, and was marketed as Pixar's first ever gay character when the movie came out in 2020. One must wonder why Moon chose this specific character to associate with the downfall of Pixar, but who knows, maybe it was just a coincidence. Except in addition to that, the pride flag can be seen somewhat faded in the background, which immediately led me to guess Moon's thesis would have to do with Pixar embracing quote-unquote wokeness, and that being the reason for their decline. That's strike one, of course. It was hard after that point to trust that their video would have any value to it, but I still couldn't help but wonder how exactly they would attempt to argue this point. I then navigated to Moon's channel, and given their selection of videos, it certainly seems to me like they're part of the highly lucrative anti-woke crowd. Not only that, but their videos appear to me to be recycled and manufactured, with many of them based on the same subjects with the same format and a consistently ingenuine feel. Think of Sunny V2 and you've more or less got the same situation here with Moon. Their videos feel similarly artificial and brand-like, but with a much more ideological culture war-focused tone. In fact, the title of the very video that caught my eye has been practically reused multiple times for various other subjects. I really do believe Moon is just a content farm spitting out these superficial videos for the sake of grifting off of right-wingers and conspiracy theorists. Their About Me page says, societal commentary taken to the next level, which just sounds pretentious and disingenuous. That's strike two. Nevertheless, despite all this, I still wanted to see how Moon would apply their framework to the apparent downfall of Pixar, so Lord help me, I actually watched their video. After having watched it, I will admit they do bring up a couple valid points, and I have to stress a couple. Maybe not even that, maybe just one, and even then, the point is argued incorrectly, and anyway, the majority of it is just about as bad as I expected. So I'm going to be responding to it, as well as using it as a jumping off point into a wider conversation I'd like to have about escapism. I'm going to be sure to link the video in the description so you can know I haven't misrepresented anything within. Without further ado, let's get started.
Pixar has one foot in the grave already. After a chain of poor movies and predictable sequels, the studio's been in a tailspin for years. Like most of Disney's conquests, Pixar has been sucked dry and tossed aside, pillaged of its creativity and turned into just another part of the Disney empire.
Moon is British. That's strike three. Anyway, moving on.
So where did the magic go? How did Pixar go from being Steve Jobs' invincible juggernaut without a single failure to the flop machine we see today? And is there any hope of a renaissance at Pixar, or have they already seen their best days? Well, to know exactly what's killing Pixar today, we need to understand why it was so successful in the first place. In 2 words, it was because of John Lasseter. His story is Pixar's story, and they've been floundering ever since he left.
Okay, so right away they're bringing up John Lasseter as pretty much the sole reason why Pixar was such a successful studio in the first place. I have some huge issues with this framing, and I'll get into those soon, but let's just start with the lowest hanging fruit. Moon claims Pixar has been struggling ever since Lasseter left, which is just really dishonest. Like, I looked this up and Disney announced Lasseter's departure from Pixar in June of 2018. The box office history of Pixar, however, proves that his departure didn't really have much of an effect on the performance of future movies, at least not provably so. The first 2 movies released after his departure, those being The Incredibles 2 and Toy Story 4, both made over $1 billion and matched previous films. The box office drop-off only began in 2020 with Onward, which, hold on, surely means Moon is actually correct, right? Blasted, if only there had been some other explanation as to how box office numbers plummeted around the time. Like, say for instance, a global pandemic provoking lockdowns that crippled the entire industry of cinema? Too bad no such explanation exists. Seriously though, it's really hard to buy the idea that Lasseter leaving the company is single-handedly responsible for why their movies haven't been doing well lately. Nothing is ever that simple, and there's bound to be a whole myriad of causes affecting the studio's recent performance. However, by watching more of this video, I soon came to realize that Lasseter supposedly being a mythical godlike figure who held the prosperity of Pixar in the palm of his hands is more or less the entire thesis. Which I find to be a grotesque and insulting point of view, not only because Lasseter is a total sex pest who should have been gone much sooner, but also because it's an example of great man theory, which I resent to hell and back. If you're not familiar, great man theory essentially posits that history is made by a few great men, such as world leaders, economic tycoons, and so-called visionaries. It's a widely contested idea, and in my view, it's nothing more than an inaccurate justification for why the richest of the rich have the exorbitant amount of wealth that they do. In reality, I find that history is made largely by masses of everyday people, and the so-called great men on top were never special, only fortunate and conniving enough to trample the rest of us through all sorts of nefarious means, or just pure luck. Applying this to Lasseter's case, I strongly disagree that he was the one behind all of Pixar's greatness. Pixar has always had a team of highly passionate and talented people working on its movies, and as a whole, they are the ones collectively building and developing the culture of the studio. Regardless, Moon doesn't agree, because they spend the vast majority of this video riding Lasseter's dick and jacking him off. I guess you could call that Lasseterbation. In addition, they also praise Steve Jobs a hell of a lot. He was the founder of Pixar, for those who don't know, which sure is interesting for someone who is supposedly against the rich and the so-called elites. I digress. I don't want to go over their whole segment detailing Lasseter's life and career, because I've already said my piece on that, and I don't feel like breaking down everything they say. I'm not exactly invested in the Lasseter lore, so to speak. Instead, I'm just going to summarize what Moon says. More or less, they insist Pixar experienced the golden age of creativity and innovation under Lasseter, and pumped out iconic movie after iconic movie, and that the decline began once Disney bought the company and began the shift towards sequels instead of original movies. Which, by the way, is the one point of Moon's I actually agree with. The over-reliance on sequels and the shift away from new stories throughout the 2010s absolutely did hurt Pixar overall, but actually that was under Lasseter's watch. And the shift back to original movies happened after Pete Docter took over as the chief creative officer after he left. So I'm not sure if that actually does support Moon's narrative that Lasseter's Pixar was the good Pixar and post-Lasseter Pixar is the bad one. Conveniently, of course, Moon blames Disney for every single thing wrong with this era, and never once entertains the idea that maybe, just maybe, Lasseter might also have been responsible for the sequel shift, being the chief creative officer of the entire company and all. In fact, even when Moon does acknowledge that Lasseter was involved with some of the sequels, they still insist those sequels were good anyway, even if the general shift towards sequels was bad.
Beginning with Toy Story 3, Pixar began to focus much more on sequels as opposed to original ideas. It didn't detract from the quality at first. Toy Story 3 was a great movie, giving a tear-jerking, satisfying ending to the series. Movies like Cars 2 and Monsters University also didn't disappoint. Lasseter was still highly involved in the process, lending his direction to Cars 2 and doing some of the writing for Toy Story 3.
Okay, hold on a moment. I just want you to stop and think about what they just said here. They said, without a hint of irony, that Cars 2 didn't disappoint. Cars fucking 2. I won't lie, right then I almost thought this video might have been an elaborate joke. I thought Justin Kerprank was going to pop out of my phone and we were all going to laugh it off. Imagine being so religiously dedicated to defending Lasseter's honor and insisting he never did anything wrong ever that you're not even willing to admit that Cars 2 is a bad movie. That is bonkers. Oh yeah, by the way, I should also mention Lasseter is responsible for Brave being a severely weaker movie than it could have been. He fired the original director, Brenda Chapman, for not falling in line with him, and replaced her with someone who had no idea what the story was about. My 25% Scottish heritage is still pissed about this to this day. Add that to the laundry list of things Lasseter has indeed done wrong. Speaking of things Lasseter did wrong, let's skip ahead to the part of the video where Moon touches upon his sexual harassment scandal, and oh boy, I'll let this speak for itself.
Lasseter would end up getting forced out over a harassment scandal. The man who turned Pixar into a cinematic juggernaut was tossed aside. Details of the allegations are murky, but they were far from criminal. Lots of people spoke up in his favour. After teams of lawyers went through it all, nothing truly serious ever came up. He would end up taking a role at an independent studio 2 years later, under Apple's control again.
It's kind of wild to me that Moon doesn't even really explain what Lasseter was accused of doing in the first place. I decided to look this up myself and found that multiple employees alleged he was fostering an environment of misogyny, as well as inappropriately grabbing, kissing, and making comments about various women working at the studio. I'm not going to lie, proven allegations or not, that actually is pretty fucking serious, and it's disgusting to me that Moon is not only downplaying the situation, but also alleging the entire thing was a setup by Disney to remove Lasseter and secure full creative control. Let me reiterate, Lasseter was a willing participant in Pixar's shift towards sequels in the 2010s, and again, it was under Pete Docter that the shift back to original movies took place. Not everything has to be a grand conspiracy. Allegations of inappropriate behavior were brought up by employees to Disney, and Disney acted on them. It's that simple. Anyway, afterward, Moon goes on to argue that after Lasseter left, things got dramatically worse as Disney kneecapped Pixar's next batch of original movies when the pandemic hit by making them exclusive to Disney+. But again, that is not because Lasseter left. I can't believe I have to say this, but no matter how much of a supposed creative genius he was, he could not have stopped fucking COVID-19. That was going to impact the industry whether he was still there or not. And once again, acting like his absence is somehow the magic explanation for everything going wrong is beyond ridiculous and frankly within the realm of fanfiction. Moving on, Moon states the recent Pixar movies are creatively bankrupt and barely memorable, which is something I also strongly disagree with. Soul is a fantastic and creative movie with a beautiful message and incredible characters, and Luca is at the very least a fun vibes movie. It is true that neither of them were all that successful, but you can again blame this on the pandemic, and not the movies themselves being bland or bad. And then we have Lightyear, and oh boy, in case you forgot Moon was part of the anti-woke crowd, this is where they officially remind you.
And Lightyear only further compounded Pixar's challenges. At first, this movie was anticipated by many. A new sequel from the Toy Story franchise, one of Pixar's most beloved stories, ended up becoming just another woke flop, as it pushed progressive messaging and forced a woke ideology onto children, leading the movie to actually be banned in several regions and hated by families across America.
I have so little patience for this, you have no idea. Woke ideology is made up bullshit. It's not real. It's what homophobic Puritans use as a dog whistle for their homophobia because they don't want to see queer people whatsoever. It's apparently perfectly fine that Pixar movies have consistently featured straight couples time and time again, and also delve into expressly political topics like the government banning superheroes, the entire planet being destroyed by pollution and abandoned by humanity, and a crime syndicate of cars enacting a mass conspiracy to gain control of the world's oil. All of that is perfectly fine within Moon's escapist childhood fantasy, but the moment two women kiss, God forbid, that's when it goes too far. That's when an ideology is being pushed onto children, and indoctrinating them with the knowledge that, believe it or not, gay people exist, and should be treated with basic dignity and respect. The straight couples are fine to the anti-woke crowd along with all the other stuff I just mentioned because they're seen as normal and gay couples aren't. The bias is obvious, it's made of fucking glass. Multiple employees alleging Lasseter sexually harassed and groped women? Not too serious, according to Moon. A lesbian kiss? Well, golly gee, call the goddamn morality police. Can you be any more transparent than this? Can you? There's not much more to the video. It more or less ends there, with Moon concluding that modern Pixar under Disney's umbrella is now more interested in pushing political messaging and uncreative slop as opposed to pioneering new masterpieces like they did before. Yada yada yada, it's all nonsense. I'm honestly so tired of trying to break down their points because to anyone who thinks about their video critically, the flaws become increasingly obvious the more time goes by. Unfortunately, those who think about the video critically are a category of people excluding the vast majority of Moon's audience. After I finished watching it, I decided to read some of the comments out of curiosity, and I began to notice an interesting pattern. Let's go through some of them. Pixar used to touch our hearts, and now they touch us inappropriately. No, the only one who touched anyone inappropriately was John Lasseter, but nice try. This is why I like this channel. Every other video essay on Pixar uncritically buys the headlines and paints Lasseter as a predator. Thank you for actually looking further into it. In reality, the accusations were incredibly minor, and at worst sounded like a guy who was overly physical, hardly a threat to anyone. To this day, people talk about him like a criminal, and he isn't. I love this comment because how exactly did Moon look further into the Laster allegations than other video essayists? They outright hand-waved away the allegations as nothing in the video without really explaining why they were so insignificant. And also, describing someone as just overly physical when the things they were accused of include non-consensual kissing and groping, along with demeaning comments, is gross and attempted normalization of sexual harassment. I'm not going to pull any punches here. Fuck this commenter for attempting to downplay something that should be so transparently wrong. Pixar and Disney started to fail when they switched from feel-good movies with relatable characters that had struggles but in the end left you with a good lesson and feeling good, to movies that pushed a particular agenda and only appeal to people who are chronically online on Twitter. Now, I could bring up the obvious fact that Pixar and Disney still make movies with moral lessons and relatable characters with struggles, many of which have an upbeat feel-good tone, but that's obvious. Instead, I'm going to save this comment for a wider point I'm going to make. I want you to put a pin in it for now. I think Pixar's problem lately, as with most of Hollywood, has been the injection of ideology in politics. People want a good story to escape from the monotony of daily life, something Pixar was profoundly good at doing. The injection of anything divisive will always alienate a portion of an audience. It also seems to constrain any creativity as you have to craft story and characters around that message/ideology. This holds with not only woke movies but religious movies as well. Both have their place with respective ideologies in art, just not when a film/art is supposed to appeal to the masses. The only studio that seems to be killing it is Illumination. I would love to see Pixar's return to formula, but I'm not holding my breath. Now, I really think it's hilarious that these people are so obsessed with hating anything woke that they are now heralding fucking Illumination as a champion of animated movies just for supposedly not including any perceived wokeness. But I digress. Might you perchance notice some similarities between this comment and the last? If you're still not quite there, don't worry, I'll give you some more time. It's really sad seeing our best and favorites animation studios fall off and just go for cash grabs, man. We'll never get films like Chicken Little. I'm sorry, I can't help but laugh. This person is really saying Chicken Little is an example of a classic animated movie we were blessed to have in its time. Holy fucking shit. Imagine being so determined to spread an old good, new bad narrative that you're praising Chicken Little. I am flabbergasted. They used to tell stories that worked on multiple levels, for kids as much as for adults at the same time, always wholesome without pushing an agenda. Now it's the complete opposite. Okay, that's it. I'm going to make my point now. The commonality I found in these comments and in the general sentiment of the video is that these people long for the old times when Pixar supposedly made wholesome, feel-good movies that could serve as an escape from reality. I want you to note one specific word here: escape. That word relates to the wider topic I'd like to segue into, that being escapism. Something I usually hear from the anti-woke crowd is that they don't want queer representation and other such progressive messaging in movies, because they view movies as an escape from a world where they already have to hear about those things. In general, there are many moviegoers who like to be immersed in fantasy and don't want to get out of that bubble, and believe me, I do get it, and I don't necessarily have a problem with that. Even I like to escape from the real world sometimes, but there is certainly an issue with an obsessive escapism and what I like to call selective escapism, which is what Moon's audience seems to be for. What I mean by selective escapism is people picking and choosing what they recognize as acceptable to their fantasies of escapist art, and excluding all that challenges them or makes them uncomfortable. With homophobes, it's easy to see what falls under that category. Anything that alludes to the existence, or even worse, the humanity of queer people, is excluded from the ideal they have in their heads of what a good, wholesome, feel-good story should contain. This is due to implicit bias instilled in them by a heteronormative culture that still marginalizes queer people and positions them as an opposing force to the quote-unquote regular cishet people. There's a reason why they think it's inappropriate for queer people to be represented, but never think the same about straight couples, or a whole myriad of other aspects of stories that are by all aspects political. Queer people and other so-called woke messages burst the bubble they want to exist within. They actively resent having to acknowledge we exist. So whenever they're confronted with our existence in art, which they expect to coddle and serve them like royalty, they throw a fit. That's really the long and short of it, and I hope you can understand why this phenomenon of selective escapism pisses me off so much. Furthermore, some people really don't like to hear this, but art shouldn't always just be a mindless escape from life. As is commonly said, art and life reflect each other. It's perfectly fine, and in fact good, for art to touch upon real-world themes and explore them, and some of the most meaningful art I've ever engaged with has been focused on exploring those themes instead of being a fantastical escape. In a sense, the obsessive desire for escapism can be considered unhealthy. Is it really a good thing if you bury yourself only in the art that conforms to your ideal fantasy of what life should be like and refuse to engage with any art that challenges you? These commenters in Moon's audience keep saying Pixar's new movies are worse because they alienate people with their messaging, but what they don't realize is that if art even so much as has a point or takes a stance on anything, it's going to alienate at least someone. Try as you may, the hard truth is that you can't make movies for absolutely everyone. And if that really was the philosophy of John Lasseter, then I'm sorry to say, he had a bad philosophy. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? It sure does explain why under Lasseter, Pixar slowly began to shift from inventive original stories to sequels. It sure does explain why the latter end of Pixar's output under his leadership was full of bland movies playing things far too safe and refusing to challenge anyone, with notable exceptions like Inside Out and Coco. It sure does explain why he fired Brenda Chapman, someone who had a creative vision in mind for Brave, and replaced her with the most cookie-cutter backup director of all time to completely trample that vision. And by God does it explain how now that he's gone and Pete Docter is in charge, Pixar is at least showing signs of heading back to its roots of original stories. Not all of them are good, mind you, for various reasons, but the story is trying new things, and is arguably far less corporate and cynical than it was prior to Docter's leadership. I'm actually excited for what Pixar does next, and I'm fucking glad Lasseter has nothing to do with it. Even disregarding his sexual harassment allegations, he long overstayed his welcome as a chief creative officer. If he was even all that instrumental to building the company's legacy in the first place, he lost sight of that vision within time, and if anything, the studio needed a change. The pandemic and the myriad of other issues with Disney has made the transition a bit of a hassle, but nonetheless, I have faith good things are coming, and unlike Moon's audience, I welcome being challenged and accept the new stories the creatives at Pixar wish to tell. On that note, thanks for watching, and have a lovely day. Posey out.